"Just kill me fast," she whispered. The rancher opened the blanket and staggered in horror. Montana, late autumn. Thomas Grayson walked the fogged edge of the woods toward a sagging fence line, tools slung over his shoulder. The air was damp and sharp, the kind that carried sound too far. That's why he noticed it. A faint creak, like rope under strain. Ahead, from a crooked willow, hung a ragged sack. It swayed in the wind, whispering against bark. As he neared, the sound sharpened, weak, shallow breathing from inside. He pulled at the coarse fabric and froze. A young woman, lips split and dry, one wrist wrapped cruelly in rusted barbed wire, stared up at him. "Just kill me fast," she rasped. Thomas peeled back the thin blanket covering her. His breath caught. Her skin bore burned symbols and deep scars, marks not meant to hurt alone but to erase her, as if someone had tried to strip away her very existence. The fog pressed closer, muffling the world until there was only the girl, the rope, and the choice. After the fire took his wife and daughter, Thomas Grayson shut his gates to the world. Neighbors spoke of him in low voices when they met in town, as though too loud a word might draw his attention and turn it sour. But there was no bitterness in Thomas anymore, just absence. There had been no funeral sermon, no line of mourners walking slowly to the cemetery. Only the sound of dirt falling on two plain coffins, and a tall man with soot still in his hair walking away without looking back. From that day on, the ranch was silent. The sound of his own boots on the porch could startle him. He filled his days with work that didn't need doing. Tightening fence wire no cattle had tested in years, mending tack for horses that rarely left the corral, stacking more firewood than a single man could burn in 2 winters. He woke before dawn, ate in silence, and ended each evening in the same chair before the hearth. The hiss and pop of burning logs were his only company. In the dim hours between wakefulness and sleep, the fire's crackle could turn to something else in his mind. The roar of flames consuming a home, the sharp report of timber snapping under heat, the echo of a woman's voice calling his name before it was swallowed by smoke. When he rode into town, it was for supplies and nothing else. His trips were short. A nod to the storekeeper, a few words about price, and he was gone. The men at the saloon learned not to call him over. The women at church stopped leaving baskets at his gate. Years bled into one another. Thomas told himself he wasn't looking for change. Change was what had destroyed him. The world beyond his fence was unpredictable, dangerous. Rivers that swelled without warning, droughts that turned the earth to stone, men who fought over land or gold or nothing at all. He had no interest in it. That's why the sight of the girl in the sack struck him like a rifle shot. The fog was heavy that morning, hanging low enough to soften the edges of the willow grove near the fence line. He'd been walking the perimeter with a hammer and nails, planning to shore up a section that had buckled in the wind. The faint creak reached him first, a sound too deliberate to be the casual sway of a branch. When the fog thinned, he saw it. A rough sack hanging from a crooked willow limb, twisting slightly in the cold breeze. Inside was the shape of a person, head bent forward, hair tangled. He stepped closer and heard it. A thin, uneven rasp of breath. Her voice came when he was near enough to see the bruises on her neck. "Just kill me fast." He cut the rope and felt how light she was, as if the wind could lift her from his arms if it tried. She didn't cling to him or resist, just sagged against him like something emptied of will. Inside the ranch house, he set her near the stove, the only heat in the place. Her eyes stayed closed, though her body twitched at the sound of the kettle settling on the iron plate. He fetched water, left it beside her with a hunk of bread, and stepped away. Trust could not be asked for in words, not now. The next day passed without much change. She woke in fits, her gaze glassy, her hands trembling when they reached for the cup. She barely ate. When the wind rattled the shutters, she flinched. Thomas didn't press her. He fixed the roof on the north side of the barn, shot a restless gelding, and kept her in sight whenever he passed the window. On the third morning, while filling the pail at the well, he heard soft footsteps in the frost. She was there, barefoot, still wrapped in the blanket, holding the empty cup. Her eyes were clearer. She came to the pump, hesitated, then stepped forward to help him work the handle. When the water filled the cup, she drank without shaking. She finished it, then filled it again. He watched the set of her shoulders ease, and that day she ate her first full meal since he'd found her. Later, walking the north fence line, Thomas spotted a glint in the grass. Kneeling, he found a locket, its chain broken. He rubbed away the dirt and saw 3 letters engraved into the metal. LDR. His stomach tightened. The mark belonged to the Landers Road Gang, thieves, murderers, worse. They worked out of Cedar Hollow, and their cruelty was no rumor. Women taken by them vanished, or turned up in places no law could reach. The locket wasn't just a clue. It was a warning. The girl hadn't stumbled here by chance. Someone had put her in that sack on his land, and that someone would come to take her back. That evening, as he added a log to the fire, he found her watching him. Her face was pale but no longer vacant. Her eyes caught the light in a way that made them seem darker. She didn't speak, but there was something in her expression. A question he understood without words. What will you do when they come? Thomas didn't know, but for the first time in years, something in him moved. It wasn't hope exactly. Hope was for men who believed in the future. This was simpler, older, a refusal to let the world take from him what it had not earned. He set the locket in his pocket, knowing it was already too late to pretend he hadn't seen it. And for the first time since the fire, the silence of the ranch didn't feel like safety anymore. It felt like the pause before a storm. The morning frost was still clinging to the fence posts when Thomas found the first sign. He'd been riding the western pasture, keeping an eye out for strays, when his horse stopped short at the riverbank. In the damp earth along the edge, pressed deep enough to pool with water, were hoof prints. Not the light prints of a rancher's mare or the narrow marks of a courier's gelding. These were heavy, wide-shot impressions from big horses, the kind used by men who expected to ride far and hard, carrying more than just their own weight. He crouched, running his fingers along the print. Fresh, less than a day old. And there was more than one set. A cluster, overlapping, heading north along the water. The girl, he still didn't know her name, was inside when he returned. She sat cross-legged on the floor by the stove, her blanket draped over her shoulders, her eyes on the flames. She looked up when he entered, and something in her gaze told him she already knew. "You've seen them before," he said. It wasn't a question. She didn't answer, only pulled the blanket tighter and stared at the kettle as though she could will it to boil faster. Thomas didn't press. If she wanted to talk, she would. If not, the truth would still find him soon enough. It always did. By midday, he had made his decision. He saddled the roan and loaded the saddlebags, not for repairs or errands, but for information. He told himself it was a simple trip into Black Ridge for flour, salt, and a coil of wire. In truth, he was going hunting, not for a man but for knowledge. The road into town wound through the pines, a narrow track that stayed cool in the shadows even as the sun climbed. He passed no one until he reached the first cluster of buildings. A blacksmith's forge, the boarding house, the saloon with its paint peeling in long strips from the sign. Inside the saloon, the smell of old beer and smoke clung to the air. The regulars glanced up when he stepped in, then looked away. Thomas wasn't the kind of man they invited to join a game of cards. He ordered a coffee, cheaper than whiskey and less likely to cloud the mind, and took a corner table. He listened. By the time his cup was half empty, he had what he'd come for women gone in the past 6 months. 2 from ranches like his, 1 from the stage stop east of town, another from a family traveling through. No sign of them after. The sheriff's name came up often, and not in praise. Word was he'd taken money to look the other way, that the disappearances weren't just tolerated but expected. The Landers Road Gang didn't operate without friends in high places, and Cedar Hollow was close enough to cast a long shadow. When Thomas finished his coffee and stepped back into the daylight, the air felt heavier. The pines beyond town seemed darker than they had that morning. He didn't head straight home. Instead, he followed the old logging road into the hills, a track most folks avoided now that the mill had been abandoned. The boards of the old buildings leaned at odd angles, the sawdust piles long washed away by rain. But the place wasn't empty. A fire burned outside one of the shacks. Shadows moved in its light, 3 men, maybe 4, laughing with the coarse, unsteady sound of men drunk on more than liquor. Thomas dismounted and tied the roan in the trees. He waited until the laughter dulled, until the fire burned lower, then moved closer, keeping to the edge of the shadows. Through a gap in the wall he saw her. Not the girl from his ranch, but another. Barely more than 16, her dress torn, her wrists bound. She sat on the floor against the wall, her eyes wide and unfocused. One of the men staggered toward her, a knife in his hand, the blade catching the firelight. Another called out something crude, and they both laughed. Thomas stepped inside without a sound, his rifle leveled. "You touch her," he said, voice low, "and you won't live to see the ground you're standing on." The first man froze. The second reached for his own knife, but Thomas swung the barrel toward him, and the fight left him all at once. He didn't bother with questions. 2 of them went down with the butt of the rifle, the third dropped his weapon and backed toward the wall. Thomas cut the girl's bindings and helped her to her feet. She was shaking too hard to walk, so he carried her out, ignoring the curses that followed. By the time they reached Black Ridge, the sun was sliding toward the horizon. He took her straight to the sheriff's office. The man looked up from his desk, his expression flat, as Thomas laid the girl's blood-stained dress and a broken blade on the wood. "She was at the old camp," Thomas said, "with 3 of them." The sheriff didn't reach for the evidence, didn't even look at the girl for more than a second. But his eyes met Thomas's, and in them was something close to acknowledgement, an unspoken understanding that this wasn't over. When Thomas rode back toward the ranch, the road felt longer than it had in years. He thought of the girl by his stove, the locket in his pocket, the hoofprints by the river. He thought of the one he'd just rescued and wondered if she would ever see home again, or if the men who had taken her would simply be replaced by others. The pines whispered overhead, and somewhere far off, a coyote called. The wind shifted, carrying with it a scent he didn't like, smoke, faint but present, from the direction of his land. He urged the roan into a trot. The last mile was the hardest. Every bend in the trail felt like it might open onto something he didn't want to see. When the ranch came into view, the gate was closed, the corral quiet. The girl was there, standing just inside the fence. Beside her, tail wagging in slow sweeps, was his old dog, a gray-muzzled cattle hound he'd thought lost years ago. She saw him and smiled. Not much, but enough to shift something inside him. The firelight from the house reached them as he dismounted. She stepped forward, the dog at her side, and said the first words he'd heard from her since that morning by the well. "Why did you come back for me?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Because this time," he said, "someone had to." Her eyes held his for a heartbeat. Then she nodded. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something. And in her gaze was a flicker of peace, fragile, but real. That night, with the dog asleep by the door and the girl settled on the bedroll near the fire, Thomas sat in his chair and listened to the quiet. The world beyond his fence was still dangerous, still unpredictable. But for the first time in years, he felt like the choice to face it might be worth making. The frost was still hard in the shadows when Thomas stepped outside. Breath from the roan drifted into the pale air like smoke from a hidden fire. The sky was pale steel, clouds low and heavy, promising snow before the week was out. Somewhere far off, a raven called, its voice echoing against the hills. Inside, Claire sat by the stove, her knees drawn to her chest, a blanket around her shoulders. She watched him move about the room, checking the rifle, sliding cartridges into his coat pocket, knotting a length of rope. Her eyes followed each motion without blinking. "They'll see you," she said, her voice soft but certain. "That's the point." She shook her head once, a small, tight gesture, but said nothing more. He crossed to the door, pausing. "Bolt the back latch. Keep the dog with you in the root cellar if you hear riders. If you have to leave, go through the pantry door and take the east ridge. Don't come back until you're sure it's clear." Her gaze didn't waver. "You've done enough for me. Don't throw yourself to them." He adjusted the strap of the rifle. If I don't go, they'll throw themselves at us anyway. The roan's hooves crunched the frozen ground as he rode out, past the willows where he had first found her. The old fence line cut across the fogged meadow, the same place he'd mended days ago. In the frost-soft earth were hoofprints overlaying his own from yesterday, broad, deep, made by horses built to carry weight. They had been close. Black Ridge lay quiet when he arrived. Smoke curled from a few chimneys. The sound of a hammer came from the blacksmith's forge. Thomas tied the roan and stepped into the general store. He bought flour, nails, lamp oil, a new lantern. Then, without hesitation, a box of .45 cartridges and a fresh length of hemp rope. The storekeeper made no comment, only rang the total and slid the goods across. At the saloon, the air was warm and heavy with stale smoke. A card game rattled in the back. A few men leaned at the bar. Thomas ordered coffee and took the same corner table he always used, his back to the wall. He drank slowly, listening. For women gone in 6 months. One found dead by the river. No arrests. The name passed in low voices. Landers Road, or LDR for short. They had friends in the right places, the kind that made lawmen look the other way. One freighter spoke of Cedar Hollow, sheds behind an old tannery, guarded by 2 men, buyers coming after dark. No one goes in unless they're invited, the man said, and no one comes out unless they're bought. By dusk, Thomas was in the timber north of town, where an old mine road twisted into the hills. The air was colder there, shadows thick under the pines. Ahead, firelight flickered through the trees. He dismounted and crept closer. 3 men sat by the fire, their horses tied to a makeshift rail. A lean-to of rough boards stood over the black mouth of a mine shaft. Thomas waited until their laughter dulled, until the fire burned low. Then he moved. The first man never saw him coming. Thomas swung the rifle stock, and he dropped without a sound. The second reached for his revolver, but a shot into the dirt by his boot stopped him cold. The third ran, only to find himself hemmed in by the mine's timbers. In less than a minute, all 3 were tied and on the ground. "You're going to tell me where you're keeping them," Thomas said, his voice flat. The man with the gun still at his feet tried to spit in the dirt, but his mouth was too dry. "Cedar Hollow," he said finally. 2 guards. "Sheriff knows. Doesn't care." Thomas left them bound in the mine, their horses freed to wander. By the time the first light touched the hills, he was back at the ranch. Claire was waiting at the gate, the dog pressed to her leg. She searched his face, saw the truth there, and didn't ask questions. When he told her he meant to bring the women back here, she hesitated. "If you bring them here, they'll follow. If I leave them there, no one comes home." She disappeared inside and returned with another coil of rope. That night, Cedar Hollow lay in shadow. The sheds crouched under the bluff like sleeping animals. The 2 guards walked a lazy circuit, boots dragging, rifles slung carelessly. Through a crack in the boards, Thomas saw 5 women, 4 huddled together on the dirt floor, 1 chained to a cot. The guards went down quick, 1 to the rifle stock, the other gagged before he could call out. Thomas freed the women, cut the chain from the cot, and led them into the trees. The night was long. Twice, he thought he heard riders tracking them. Once, a shape moved in the moonlight far behind, but no one came close enough to test him. Near dawn, they reached the ranch. Claire met them at the gate, ushered them inside. She tended their wounds in silence, her movements precise, her face unreadable. By mid-morning, riders appeared, Deputy Fry and 2 men Thomas didn't know. Fry claimed they were tracking stock thieves, but his eyes lingered on the door to the main room. "There are 5 women in there," Thomas said evenly, "each with a story you don't want on your conscience." Sheriff Klein arrived soon after, his face unreadable. He stepped inside, saw the burns and the marks, and said nothing for a long time. Then, in a voice like stone, he agreed to take statements, but warned Thomas that men with money could still find their way around the law. As the women rested, Fry lingered. In a low voice, he told Thomas of a freight wagon behind the livery, and used, keys hanging on a nail. "If you want them gone without notice," he said, "that's your way." By midday, the wagon rolled east, the women inside. Claire rode with them. She asked Thomas again why he'd come back for her. Because this time, someone had to, he said. He watched them vanish down the road, past the willow where it had begun. Then he turned the roan toward Cedar Hollow. He left the sheds empty, the chains uncoiled. On the doorframe, with a carpenter's pencil, he wrote 3 words. I saw you. The wind swung north after sundown and carried rumors with it. By the time the lamps were lit in Black Ridge, Thomas knew 2 things. Lelandre Riley had friends richer than their god, and those friends had hired riders who liked money more than sleep. Klein sent Fry at dusk with a warning. They posted a bounty on you and any harborers. The deputy said, hat in both hands. Paper says you led women to steal from respectable men. Thomas glanced at the 5 blankets near the stove, at the careful bundle of ledgers the priest had taken down in his neat hand. We didn't steal anything, he said. We took back what cannot be owned. Fry's jaw worked. Respectable men write the posters. They made arrangements as if laying out seed for spring. The priest would keep the statements at the church. 2 teamsters would haul the freed women out of town before midnight. East Road, Ridge Trail. Klein swore in 3 farmers as temp deputies. Not for guns, but for eyes. Fry left a small tin key on Thomas's table. Locks the bell rope. If you hear the wrong shoes coming, ring until my heart wakes. The women packed without sound. Claire moved among them, tying shawls, pressing slices of bread into hands that had forgotten what it meant to keep something. She stopped only once, at the doorway, when Thomas handed her a little sack, dried apples. The locket marked LDR. Give this to the priest, he said. Tell him to nail it to his ledger's first page. I can stay, she said. You can live, he answered. She studied his face. Those are not different? Tonight they are. He watched the wagons leave, small lights woven into darkness, and only when the road swallowed them did he let the quiet inside the house touch him. The dogs settled by the door. The stove ticked like a nervous metronome. Somewhere far off, a hammer rang at the smithy, 1, 2, 3 blows. Then a long pause, as if the town itself were counting. They came just after midnight. No torches. These were not boys. Lanterns hooded, horses padded. Thomas caught the smell first. Oiled leather, stale whiskey, money. He stepped onto the porch unarmed and let them see his hands. There were 9 at the fence and more behind. Shapes that suggested numbers rather than names. A man with a scar that cut his ear in half leaned forward in his saddle. You're Thomas Grayson. Tonight, Thomas said. You got our property mixed up with pity. We're here to sort it. That word, Thomas said, is why you're losing. He could feel their surprise at the lack of fear. Surprise is the small advantage a man can choose. The scarred rider nodded toward the yard. We ain't here to jaw. Our instructions are simple. Take back what was purchased. Take down the fool who stirred it. Your instructions are old, Thomas said. Today the sheriff took statements, and the priest wrote them with your names. Noon tomorrow, the bell rings, and your buyers will hear themselves spoken aloud. A chuckle moved through the line like dry grass taking fire. Then we'll ring our own bell now. Scar lifted a hand. Before he could drop it, a boy urged his horse forward from the second line. He was no older than 17, with the pale look of someone who never saw himself doing what his hat declared. Rook, he said to Scar. They said no blood at the ranch. Just smoke. Just fear. He glanced at Thomas. Man's got a dog. Dog bites as hard as a man, Scar said. Harder sometimes. He didn't take his eyes off Thomas. We ain't here to discuss pets. Thomas stepped off the porch, slow. He felt the dog press against his calf, all muscle and vow. You can set a fire, he said, and learn what burns when a town reads its own ledger. Or you can ride back to Riley and tell him this ground is crowded with more witnesses than he paid for. The boy's mare danced. Scar slapped her nose with his rein. Not cruelly, just to show who owned the motion. You think paper breaks a bit in a horse like Riley? He grinned. Paper tears. Smoke blows. Money stays. Now. A rifle clicked behind Thomas. Claire stepped from the shadow of the door with a lantern hooked on her elbow, and the priest's little book clutched to her stomach like a child. She had come back. "I told you to live," Thomas said without turning. "I am," she said. Scar squinted. "You the one with the pretty wrists?" She raised the lantern. The brands glowed like hot coins. In that small circle of light, the men's faces changed from boys' games to men's choices. Scar's grin wavered and returned, thinner now. "Heard of you," he said. "They marked you because mercy needs a collar." Claire said, "And yet you came in darkness." The boy swallowed. "Ma'am," he said, and looked at Scar, and then at his own hands, as if he couldn't remember when they had started to be someone else's. Thomas took the lantern from Claire and set it on the porch rail. He spoke to the boy, not the gang. "Ride home," he said. "Tell your mother you worked late shoeing horses. Tell her you quit a job before it quit you." Scar's laugh came back full. Forced now, a man losing a room. "No one leaves when I'm speaking," he said, and turned his horse a quarter to show the pistol under his coat. "We'll start with smoke. Roofs first. If the bell rings, shoot the rope." "Shoot the rope," the boy echoed hollow. The dog's growl rose from deep in his chest. Thomas felt the sound push against his boot. He held up his empty hands. "Last offer," he said. "Turn around. In the morning, you can say to yourselves you spared a house that would have taught your names to a judge. You can say you walked away from a woman who will not lift her sleeves for your shame." Scar leaned in the saddle. "And if we don't? Then we count," Thomas said. "Not bodies. Choices." Scar gave the smallest nod. The second line fanned to the right. 3 peeled left, angling for the well. Thomas heard the creak of a matchbox. Claire took a breath beside him that sounded like a winter branch under snow. The bell did ring, but not from the church. Fry had run a line from the frame of Thomas's hay shed to the iron tongue and rigged a counterweight from an old plow wheel. When the first rider ducked to slip between gate and post, his hat brushed the wire. The wheel dropped. Iron spoke. The sound leapt the fields in waves. Windows lit. Dogs answered. A startled rooster crowed like a fool hero. The riders froze as if sound could be a rope. Scar hissed, "Cut it." The boy didn't move. He was watching Claire's burns as though they were scripture. Another man spurred forward and fired at the bell. The ball took a chip off the lip, but the tongue kept swinging, counting. From the house's side yard came a flash and a crash. Thomas's powder flare, shot from a length of stovepipe he'd bolted to a sawhorse in summer to frighten off coyotes. It threw a white flower against the night sky, bright enough to make shadows forget where they belonged. The horses danced. One rider lost his seat and swore like a man who had dropped his name in a creek. "Enough," Scar said, voice tightening. He raised his pistol at Claire. Thomas stepped into the shot and did not stop. "Look at me," he said. For an instant, Scar did. And in that instant, the boy's mare moved her own mind and bumped Scar's stirrup. The kind of horse thought no man commands. The pistol cracked. The ball tore a shard from the porch post and sang away into the yard. The dog lunged and then stopped at Thomas's word as if the word were a fence. Someone shouted, "Law!" Fry and 2 farmers were coming at a gallop, lanterns swinging. Not enough men to fight, more than enough to be seen. Behind them, Klein's hat showed, and Brother Hale's collar, pale in the dark. Scar exhaled a laugh that had run out of gas. "Later then," he said. But it sounded like a man trying to make a bluff pay after the cards were on the table. He turned his horse and whistled twice. The right wing wheeled. The left wing fought itself and then obeyed. The boy hung back a heartbeat longer, looking at Claire, then at Thomas, and then at the gravel by his boot, where a drop of tallow from the flare had fallen and cooled into the shape of a tear. He lifted his reins and followed. Fry swung down, breath steaming. "You all right?" "We are counted," Thomas said. Klein looked past him at the porch post, at the chip missing, at the dog's rough high as wire. "He'll be back," the sheriff said. "I know," Thomas answered. He glanced toward the ridge where the flare's smoke thinned into star. "Tomorrow is paper. Tonight was weather." Claire put her hand on the bell rope and steadied its last tremble. The sound of it seemed to hang in the cold air even after it went quiet. like a word the mouth finishes but the chest keeps saying. The town lights stayed on longer than needed, as if homes could stare. "We can go to my sister's," Fry said to Claire. "She's got room." "I'll be here," she said. "Riders know where to aim. I'll know where to stand." Thomas wanted to argue and did not. He set the lantern back on its nail. He drew a line in his mind between the church door and the judge's desk and saw himself walking it. "They'll come mean," Klein said. "Not for your hide first. For your quiet." "Then I won't give them quiet," Thomas said. He pictured the noon bell, the priest's slow hand, the names coming one after another like fence posts set true. In the yard, the wind shifted again, and with it the smell. Not smoke, not whiskey. Snow close in the clouds, the kind that falls sure. The dog lay down and blew out his breath like a man relieved by nothing except the telling. "Get some sleep," Fry said. "Tomorrow we make a town answer itself." Thomas stood in the doorway with Claire a long time, listening to a silence that had chosen to stay. When at last he spoke, it was to the room and to the road and to the men who would return carrying their own shadows. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," she answered. The rain had stopped, but the air was heavy with the smell of wet earth and gunpowder. The moon broke through the clouds in jagged intervals, casting silver light over the ranch and the bodies it held. Tobias crouched behind the low stone wall near the barn, eyes sweeping the ridge where the torches still burned like watchful eyes. Ayanna moved beside him, silent as shadow, her blade glinting when the moon caught it. She didn't need to speak. The lines around her eyes told him she had already counted every enemy, memorized every position. 20 men, at least. "They think we're cornered," Tobias murmured. "Good. Let's make them right. Just long enough to kill that idea." The Apache women fanned out, each taking ground Tobias had shown them in the brief minutes since the reinforcements arrived. He dug trenches here 8 years ago, in the paranoid weeks after his family's deaths. And now every ditch, every hidden line of barbed wire, every blind corner became a weapon. A baby's cry cut through the night again. Closer this time. Tobias's jaw tightened. Somewhere in that enemy camp was a child who didn't belong here, and if the shooting started, it wouldn't last long. He couldn't think about that yet. Survival first, then the rest. The enemy's leader, a tall man with a black hat and a voice like gravel, barked orders. 2 squads split from the main group, moving low toward the house. They stepped carefully, scanning the dark, professional enough to suspect traps, but too confident to believe they'd lose. They were wrong. The first man hit the caltrops Tobias had scattered. His scream was sharp and sudden, and when he fell, 2 more stumbled into the wire strung low across the path. Metal bit into flesh, pulling men off balance and down into the mud. Gunfire erupted, shattering the night. Ayanna's women struck like lightning, arrows in the dark, knives whispering through cloth and skin. The rain-slick ground became a killing floor. Tobias fired twice from behind the wall, dropping a man near the well and another who tried to drag his wounded friend to cover. The enemy leader shouted for a retreat, but pride outweighed caution. More men charged, hoping to overwhelm with numbers. Tobias and Ayanna fell back toward the porch, drawing them in, making the house look like a desperate last stand. It was working until Tobias heard a sound that didn't belong. Hoofbeats. 1 horse, moving away from the fight. He caught Ayanna's eye, jerking his head toward the sound. She nodded once, understanding. The child. Without a word, Tobias slipped from the fight, moving low along the outer fence line. He found the rider quickly, a young soldier hunched over his saddle, a small bundle strapped in front of him. The baby. The boy's rifle was slung and his attention fixed behind him, where the gunfire still raged. Tobias stepped into his path, rifle raised. "Off the horse. Now." The boy froze, then slowly slid down, keeping one hand near the child. "I didn't want this," he said quickly. "Captain said we'd just be chasing raiders. And my wife's gone. Nowhere to leave him." Tobias kept the rifle steady. "Then you picked the wrong company." The soldier's eyes darted toward the ridge. "If you let me go, I'll disappear. Take him somewhere safe. But if they see me talking to you, they won't, Tobias cut in. You're going to ride due east slow. You hear gunfire stop, you don't look back. The boy hesitated, then nodded. You're not the kind of man they said you were. Tobias almost laughed. Neither are you. Now go. The soldier swung back into the saddle and was gone, vanishing into the night with the baby's cry fading behind him. When Tobias returned, the battle was nearly done. The yard was littered with bodies, most of them Morrison's men. The survivors had fled into the darkness, leaving their dead where they fell. Ayanna stood on the porch, chest heaving, her knife red to the hilt. She met his gaze with something between relief and warning. This was only the first wave. By sunrise they'll have more, twice as many. Tobias glanced around his battered ranch. Then we don't wait for sunrise. Ayanna's eyes narrowed. You mean to run? I mean to take this fight to someone who thinks they can hide behind orders. He looked out toward the east, where the soldier and child had vanished. I know where they'll regroup, and if we move now, we end this before it spreads. Her mouth curved into the faintest of smiles. You've been alone too long, Tobias Redmont. He returned the look. Not anymore. The clouds swallowed the moon again, plunging the ranch back into darkness. Somewhere far off, a coyote called. Tobias checked his rifle, feeling the weight of the night ahead settle on his shoulders. The war had come to his door. Now he was going to return the favor. The wind carried the smell of wet dust and gunpowder, mingling with the sharp tang of blood. In the wavering torchlight outside Tobias's ranch, Marshal Webb stood stiff as a man carved from stone, his pale eyes darting between Ayanna, Bradley, and the deputies who no longer obeyed him. The rain had thinned to a cold mist, just enough to make every movement slick and treacherous. Inside, Tobias felt the weight of every choice pressing down on him. Morrison's body lay cooling by the broken doorway. The baby in the young woman's arms let out a soft, fretful sound. Outside, horses stamped and shifted, uneasy, sensing the tension in their riders. Ayanna took a step forward, her gaze fixed on Webb. You still have a choice, she said evenly. Stand aside and live to see what truth does when it's given light, or die here, clinging to lies. Webb's jaw worked, but no words came. His hand flexed on his pistol grip. Bradley, standing between him and Ayanna, didn't move an inch. Then, from the darkness beyond the torches, a voice barked, deep, commanding. Marshal Webb, report. Everyone froze. Out of the mist rode a new figure, tall in the saddle, a black oilskin coat dripping with rain. His hat brim shadowed his face until the torchlight caught it. Angular features, cold eyes that swept the scene and missed nothing. Colonel Harrow. Tobias didn't know him, but Ayanna's subtle intake of breath told him all he needed. This was a man she recognized and feared. Harrow's gaze slid to the dead captain on the floor. I see you've been busy, he said. Webb straightened, grasping at the lifeline. Colonel, these fugitives killed Morrison. I was just... Save it. Harrow cut him off. We both know Morrison's talent for making enemies. Dead or alive, he's no longer a concern. The question is... His eyes shifted to Ayanna. What to do with our honored guest? Ayanna didn't blink. You mean your scapegoat? A faint smile touched Harrow's lips. Scapegoats serve a purpose. They keep people from asking the wrong questions. Tobias could feel the air tightening, that dangerous stillness before a trigger is pulled. Bradley broke it. Sir, with respect, Ayanna didn't kill Morrison. There's proof. That letter. Harrow interrupted smoothly. Already worthless. The men named in it will never stand trial. The deputies shifted uneasily. Harrow's confidence was the kind of poison that seeps into men's spines and makes them doubt their own eyes. Ayanna's voice cut through it. The council will hear my words. And when they do, they won't, Harrow said flatly. In that instant, Tobias knew the colonel hadn't come to arrest anyone. He'd come to end this permanently. Ayanna must have seen the same truth in his eyes, because she moved a fraction closer to Tobias and murmured, "The cellar." Now, they moved as one. Bradley hesitated only a second before covering them, his rifle tracking Harrow's men as Tobias guided Ayanna and the others toward the back. But Harrow wasn't fooled. "Stop them," he ordered. The yard erupted in motion. Boots pounded through mud. Horses snorted. Steel flashed. Bradley fired one shot, then another, dropping 2 men before the rest dove for cover. Tobias slammed the cellar door open, ushering the women inside. Ayanna paused at the threshold. "You can still walk away," she told him. "Not my style," he said, shoving her down the steps and swinging the door shut. He turned just as the first of Harrow's soldiers rounded the barn. Tobias's Winchester came up smooth, almost gentle, and the man dropped before his finger eased off the trigger. But for every one that fell, more came. The ranch yard became a maze of shifting shadows, muzzle flashes, and the dull thud of boots hitting wet earth. Bradley fought like a man with nothing left to lose, buying them precious seconds. Then Harrow himself stepped forward, revolver in hand. His shot tore the air beside Tobias's head, splintering wood. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, Hartwell," Harrow called. "Hand her over, and maybe I let you live." Tobias's laugh was short and bitter. "8 years alone, Colonel. You think I'm scared of dying now?" They circled each other, the rain turning the ground to slick clay. In the distance, the faint rush of water grew louder, the runoff from the hills feeding the dam. Tobias's mind flicked to the explosives he'd left behind. The plan he'd almost abandoned. Maybe it wasn't abandoned after all. He broke for the barn, bullets snapping at his heels. Behind him, Harrow cursed and gave chase. Inside, Tobias skidded to the workbench, grabbed the satchel of dynamite, and lit a fuse with the match clenched between his teeth. When he burst back into the yard, Harrow froze, eyes flicking from the burning fuse to the direction Tobias was running. "You wouldn't," Harrow said. "Watch me." The colonel's shout to his men was lost under the sudden roar as Tobias hurled the satchel into the runoff channel. The explosion tore the night apart. A moment later, the hillside groaned and gave way, releasing a wall of black water that surged down toward the valley. Shouts turned to screams as men scrambled for higher ground. Horses reared and bolted. Harrow's curses vanished in the chaos. Tobias didn't wait to see who made it out. He yanked open the cellar, hauling Ayanna and the others into the open. "Time to go," he said. They slipped into the night, leaving the ranch and the bodies to the rising flood. For the first time in 8 years, Tobias felt something like freedom. But it came with the bitter taste of knowing Harrow wasn't dead. And a man like that never stopped hunting.